Hi, Professor, or anyone else who might be watching this. We are unpacking Paul Tripp's book, Lead. I don't know if this will be reversed on the video or not, but here it is. And we're talking about chapter 10 when he talks about the principle of restoration in the leadership of the church. And so that we need to have a community that is committed to that, or just creating an environment that is conducive to a leader's fresh start, or a new beginning for them. And Tripp points out that grace, it means that we're not held to the worst moment of our lives, or even cursed by the worst decision that we've ever made. He posed a question in the book that I found was interesting. He said, think about the way that we think about leaders today. Okay, would we have restored any of the biblical characters to a place of spiritual leadership after their conduct? I mean, he mentioned after Moses killed someone and fled Egypt, or after what King David did to Uriah in order to secure Bathsheba, or after Peter just pretended to have no affiliation with Jesus 3 times, or after Jonah ran the complete opposite way when the Lord called him to Nineveh, or Paul, when Paul did all the things Paul did. Do you think that we would have reinstated any of them to leadership? Or do you think we would say, you know what, as far as usefulness in the kingdom goes, I think you're done? Yeah. I mean, I think about how I got here, where I am today from where I've been, and how lost I was. And I'm just thankful that God is in the business of restoration. He's in the business of reconciliation and deliverance, which is what Tripp is pointing out here. May we never forget that we all have been restored by God's grace, that we are being restored by God's grace, and that we will all finally be restored by God, who is simply just not going to quit until his restorative mercies have completely rebuilt us into the likeness of Christ. And Tripp, he really paints a picture of the Lord's heart for restoration with the tale of Jonah in the Bible, and with a pastor who is called out by his congregation for being a drunk. It would seem that when Jonah fled from the Lord's calling, that was the end of him being used. The drunk pastor's actions, it would seem, that was the end of the story, when that produced a fractured community that was split between, that camp that would defend the sinning pastor and basically allowed his sin to have more room to grow deeper roots and a firmer hold, from those who were just quick to boot him, and give him a severance package on the way out. Both situations seemed like that was the end of the story. And yet, with work and time, that pastor, he did go on to return to ministry. And the Lord relentlessly pursued Jonah. But there is a warning with that story. See, eventually Jonah makes his way to Nineveh, but his heart did not catch up with his calling. So while he was following the Lord's instruction in action, he wanted to deny this community grace and mercy because he was angry with them. It reminds us that pastors, they can be going through the motions of ministry, but they can lose their connection to their heart and to the Lord's heart for his people. So Tripp reminds us that we have to be very aware when there becomes a gap between confessional theology and our functional theology. The gospel of grace teaches us that a lasting change of heart and hands always takes place in the context of first a relationship with God, and second, with the people of God. And Tripp is inviting us to be the kind of community of grace and restoration where a leader who needs help can receive it from God's people and then go about the work of restoring a heart and healing from the sin that had taken a hold of it with the Lord's help. And Tripp even suggested some practical tips. He said for the pastor, surround the pastor with elder or diaconal care. Surround the pastor's wife. Perhaps the elders' wives can help her navigate the tumultuous time. Have babysitters on call, so the pastor and his wife can have room to work through this, maybe through some addiction counseling. I mean, we've all been there where we've needed someone to look past our circumstances and not judge us and just see our potential in how God can be at work in the process. And so it's worth pointing out also that there's no promises here that he'll be ushered back to his position of leadership. There needs to be a heart posture change, and that is a process. But that process is ongoing, and it requires the support of a community that values restoration, but understands that there's no quick fixes here. And I mean, it really is amazing when we can return to ministry after a fall, but we aren't returning as the people we were when we left. As Tripp points out, if this process is to occur, we need forgiving grace from our community. We need reconciling grace. We need a restoring grace. And we need a delivering grace where our community actually trusts in the Lord's power to redeem someone. It almost caught me a little bit by surprise when Tripp had pointed out that sin is revealed by our divine restorer as almost a kind of gift to us, because God loves the leader and he wants it to be revealed. We're all in the middle of our own sanctification process here. And I mean, it sure does provide quite the opportunity for dramatic growth when we are called to confront our sin, but it's a gift if we can find ourselves confronted by a community that desires or is equipped to walk alongside us as we are wrestling with these things. And that's if we are not caught up in the initial spirit of offense for being called out by them in the first place. But we as the church are called to function as his arm of convicting and restoring grace. If we so freely accept this mercy for all the ways that we go astray, how dare we deny it to someone else? And particularly the leaders that are being crushed by the weight of their leadership position. No, we are to be agents of God's restoring mercy, or pray that he equips us to be. So I love what Tripp had to say in this chapter, and to be honest, I feel personally challenged by it, because on page 184, he talks about Jonah, and he said that Jonah was called to be a minister of the gospel. And he said, the gospel, you say? But yes, because if you are called to give a message of warning, then you are called to be representing the Lord's willingness to give people the opportunity to listen and to examine and to confess and to turn. And this is gospel work. If all God wanted to do was to judge us, then he wouldn't warn us first, right? So God's warning is a beautiful aspect of his grace, and that's what Tripp reminds us of. And so I loved how this calls me higher, right? It's not just to call it out in others, but to be of the mind to call it out in myself and trust in his restoring power so that I can be freed from the bondage of myself, as Tripp talks about in here. And I'm just so thankful that like Jonah, he never gave up on me. And through all of my rebellion and all of my wandering, he just called out to me again and again. And here I am. So I'm encouraged to take the principle of restoration to heart and to willingly encourage my community to do the same.